some armed robbers or something. I think actually Nairobi is just as dangerous as Congo can be. But in Goma, for example, the place closes down after dark, and it's really unsafe after dark. This doesn't apply to people working for humanitarian agencies or the UN. They all have their big fancy four-wheel drives, and they can lock the doors, and they can move through the city pretty quickly. But for somebody working like me who doesn't have that kind of a budget or that kind of equipment, it can be very dangerous and difficult. And at the same time, it's an amazingly safe place in many respects. You would feel more unsafe walking through parts of L.A. or parts of New York than you would even in Kinshasa sometimes, so it's all relative. The media whips up this tribal specter of fear, and, it needs to be kept in proper perspective.
So there must be a big difference between the cities and the rural areas.
Yeah, Kinshasa is actually a very developed city, big skyscrapers and everything. Not skyscrapers like you'll see in other capital cities around the world or even in Africa, but they're still quite tall buildings, and there's an amazing amount of construction going on this year now because of after the elections things have settled down a little bit. But the rural areas, if you get out to the rural areas, and it's really a trek to get out to some of the most rural parts of the Congo, and by the time you get out there, you can be exhausted just getting to the place you want to get to try to figure out what's going on. In 2005, I left off from the city of Lisala, which is on a fairly small, you can't really call it a city, it's kind of a sprawling little town. And it had a palace where Mobutu lived for a while. It was one of his many palaces, and it's right on the Congo River. And we set off from the Congo River. I was working with another journalist, and we crossed the river, and then we walked for 7 days to get to this tributary of the Congo called the Lopori River, and then we built a raft out of 3 dugouts, built a platform on it, and put a roof on it, and then we floated for 3 weeks down the Lopori River without a motor with 2 local guys who were paddling. And this was to access these really remote areas that you could fly in if you were in some of the places. There's small remote airstrips, like USAID or intelligence people for the U.S. have flown into some of these remote airstrips. But as I said, for a guy like me or my friend, it was impossible to get in there. So we built a raft and floated down the river and took testimony from people all along the way about the human rights situation, about who they've seen, what kind of militias were there, who's working there from the so-called conservation community and the humanitarian community, and the exploitation, meaning logging or mining or plantations or other petroleum perhaps, or other kinds of exploitation that might be going on in the area. So that's how I kind of mapped out big parts of the Congo where I did travel. And there's huge parts of the Congo I haven't even been close to. It's as big as the United States from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ohio River, and about as long as Maine to Florida, I believe. So it's a huge place. And the stories that we could talk about that aren't being told are amazing. There's numerous stories that are very important.
Well, before we talk about the stories, could you quickly tell us what the weather's like there? Is it hot and steamy, or is it cold? What's it like?
You can find both of those. You can find hot and steamy. You can find cold. You can get up into the mountains in the eastern part, in the rainforest. Some of the Volcanoes National Park, for example, the Congo, the Kahuzi-Biega National Park, the mountains are quite high, and it can get quite cold, especially at night. Very cold, in fact. I slept out there with soldiers once. And then in Kinshasa, it's hot and steamy, and it's like I can't figure it out. Once I learned that it was a triple rainy season, means that there's 3 times a year that there would be long periods of rain. But I don't know if that's true. It just seems to rain sometimes, and it doesn't rain other times, and so the more rain there is, the more humid it is, and you're just sweating, and your clothing's just soaked if you're walking around, and within minutes. And in Equateur and Oriental, the 2 provinces up there, north and around the Congo River where the rainforest is, it's unbearable all day long, just unbearable heat. And it just saps your energy, even when you have food. And for the people who don't have food, most of the time, it's a pretty difficult life condition. And of course, that's all unnecessary because there's plenty of plantations and business exploitation, business enterprises that have been operating in all of these regions, since King Leopold, which was 1895.
I'm speaking with journalist and human rights investigator Keith Snow. Today's show, Blood Diamonds and Devastation in Congo. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Well, what would you say would be a short list of some of the very important events and news stories that should be being covered currently in Congo?
Well, to start off, to lay the framework to answer that question, I would say in 1895, King Leopold sent his man, a journalist, Henry Morton Stanley, from the New York Post, into the Congo as his agent to organize the rubber and the ivory exploitation, put a propaganda face on it that said that what he was really doing was stopping the slavery. And at the time, Henry Morton Stanley set up these networks using the local people as arming them and using Belgians as well, and dividing and conquering across the Congo. And this is exactly where I went, up to this part of Kisangani, for example. That was the heart of Leopold's enterprise. And he did this by they were cutting people's hands off if they didn't produce the quota, and that's how they kept the rubber and the ivory flowing out. Every bullet that was shot, they had to produce a hand that showed that the person had been killed. Now, this is basically what's going on today. They don't cut people's hands off, although they do in Sierra Leone, and that revolves around the diamonds, if you saw Blood Diamond. But in the heart of the Congo, there's this incredible slavery going on. It's been redefined in a certain way that it isn't quite the slavery that you had under Leopold, but it's a system of exploitation that forces people to continue to work under the most atrocious conditions with absolutely no choices. They're dying like flies in some places. They're getting, if you can call it getting paid, as little as $2 a month to work every single day, or at least 6 days a week because they go to church if they're lucky, 6 days a week to make $2 a month from a plantation company that's run by an American guy. So you've got this incredible slavery going. If the media from the United States or from Europe or the BBC, for example, reports that at all, it's always Africans committing slavery against Africans, or children, how they have to work for their parents, and it's slavery. But they never talk about the white guys behind all of this. So the situation that occurred under King Leopold 100 years ago is basically what you've got in Congo today. And the war, of course, stirred that all up, stirred up the organized crime under Mobutu and his racketeering networks. And, of course, Mobutu came after the Belgian colonial enterprise, which basically put everything in place to make it all happen. So that's the framework in which to answer that question. So anything you see in the American media is basically completely deceptive. What are the stories that are not being told? Slavery in the Congo, plantation slavery, run by an American family like the Blattner family, the OM Group, which is owned by George Forrest. OM Group is in Ohio. George Forrest is exploiting the Congo since 1922. He has all kinds of businesses there, but one of the primary ones recently that's been very much associated with the war is the coltan, columbium tantalite. It's a mineral used for cell phones and Sony PlayStations and laptop computers. And you don't see George Forrest's name mentioned anywhere. Instead, you see African tribes fighting each other in the Congo. Those Africans do that, and that's the way it is. Logging, same company, the Blattner family. Massive logging concessions in the Congo. Logging in situations where they're stripping out, for example, there's concessions all over the northern Congo. They've been given out to all of these powerful people and companies from around the world, Portugal, Belgium, France, England, United States, Australia. Japan has an interest in this, and Korea and China. They're sticking their fingers in there, too. That's part of the reason for the war. But let's stick to this American company called the Blattner family. James Blattner was the father, and he had 3 sons, and they divided it up. And today you've got Elwin and David and one more Blattner son. But these guys run logging, they run transport, they run river transport, they run construction, and they run some of the plantations. And the Blattner family has 6 plantations. Each plantation has something like 1,000 to 3,000 people working on it. Each plantation is producing 2 or 3 or 4 of these key products. Rubber, chocolate, which would be cocoa beans, coffee beans, palm oil. The people, as I said, working on some of these plantations are making as little as $2 a month. When I say they don't have any choices, they can't go anywhere. They can't leave. There's nowhere for them to go. There's no land that's available for them to move to. If they did, they would go to the city. In the process of escaping to the city, they would be hit with all of these levies and fines and extortion, and they would need papers to do that, to travel. Or else they'd potentially, especially women, be picked up and